always want to say good morning because it's morning where I am. However, it is late afternoon / almost evening, I think, where our guest Christine is. So wherever you are joining us from in the world, welcome. We're really happy to have you here for this second Sunday Dharma series. As you know, if you've been here with us before, we do this on the second Sunday of every month, where we invite someone from outside of our community to come and talk to us about a Dharma-related topic. So sometimes those are well-known Dharma teachers. Today, we have an award-winning journalist. So we'll get to our conversation with Christine in a moment. But a reminder that this event is a fundraiser for the Insight Meditation community of Washington. And I just want to thank you so much for the donations, the dana that you have offered to be here with us today. It really helps us to run our programs. So just a note about what's coming up. Next month in December, we are going to be talking to Ben Conley, who has written a book about the topic of Yogacara, which is a Buddhist approach to understanding consciousness. So it's really cool, actually. I think you will enjoy that. And then in January, we're going to be talking to Shayla Catherine on her book called Beyond Distraction: 5 Practical Ways to Focus the Mind. So that's what's coming up. All right. So for our session also, I just want to mention and thank our ASL interpreters, Denise and Deb, are going to be with us today as we have ASL interpretation for all of these events. So thank you so much for that contribution. So important. Also, a note, I believe that you can enable the closed captioning at the bottom of your screen if you need to do that, the live transcription. Okay, so Christine is joining us from England, and thank you so much for being here to talk about her book, In Search of Buddha's Daughters. So Christine is an award-winning journalist who has reported from over 60 countries worldwide, covering foreign affairs for the Sunday Times. And Christine, I was pulling this from your bio. It said for over 20 years, but it might be more than 20 years now. So a longtime journalist covering things around the world, and has twice won Amnesty International awards for Story of the Year. So thank you for being here. And when I came across your book, In Search of Buddha's Daughters, which is stories that Christine has written about nuns that she visited as she kind of traveled the world in search of who these women are. So we'd like to start with a short video, I think it's under 2 minutes, that really kind of sets the scene for us on some of Christine's travels. So yeah, let's sit tight and watch this video for just a couple of minutes.
At the heart of Buddhism lies the truth that in life there is inevitable suffering. What defines us is how we face the suffering. Looking back at what I've witnessed as a journalist, I've sometimes struggled to understand the madness of the world. The first time I met a Buddhist nun, she told me a story of unspeakable hardship. I couldn't forget my encounter with Nima and went searching for more of Buddha's daughters. I found the most extraordinary women I'm ever likely to meet. Brave, wise women who teach courage and whose lives are driven by a longing to achieve enlightenment and to help others achieve it too. They come to the ordained Buddhist path from every faith and background in the East and West. A former policewoman, a princess, a Bollywood star, a concert violinist. Their practice varies widely too. In Nepal, I visit nuns who practice Kung Fu for spiritual and physical empowerment. Another nun talks of being imprisoned in Burma, accused of impersonating a monk. Through their stories of strength and wisdom, I experienced an unforgettable journey. Now I hope you'll come with me in search of Buddha's daughters.
Okay, so thank you so much for showing that. Just really beautiful. We can kind of see some of the scenery where these nuns were living and practicing. So, Christine, tell us a little bit about yourself, and as a journalist, what drew you to this topic, and why you chose to write this book. As people can see, it was in 2016. Thank you.
Yeah, it came out in the States in 2016. It actually came out first in the UK under the title The Saffron Road. And I started writing it in 2012. And I came to it really totally unexpectedly, because I'd gone to interview the newly elected Prime Minister of Tibet, who is taking over the temporal duties of the Dalai Lama, so the first democratically elected Prime Minister, Lobsang Sangye. And while I was in Dharamsala interviewing him, I started meeting nuns who had traveled over the Himalayas from Tibet, and were living in nunneries in Dharamsala. And the first story I heard of a nun that the book opens with, Nima, was just such an incredible story. I just really, I couldn't forget it. She had she'd become a nun at a very young age, which is not uncommon in the East particularly. And she had stood on a corner in Tibet protesting the recent Chinese government decree to not allow girls to enter monastic training before the age of 18. And she was immediately arrested and put in prison for 5 years, 2 years in solitary confinement, along with a lot of other nuns who were also imprisoned in Tibet. And she was very, very badly treated, tortured, and had come through terrible experience. And it wasn't uncommon. This is some of the other stories I heard. But so originally my plan was to go back and just write a story. The article was for the Sunday Times magazine. But when I started looking into the lives of Buddhist nuns in different parts of the world, I mean, it was just like opening a door onto this incredible world of wisdom that I was just captivated by. And I have to thank you, Trisha, for inviting me to take part in this event, because as I think I said to you before, it's really it's got me to read my book again, because I finished it in 2016, and I was then caught up in an experience of a terrible earthquake in Italy in 2016, just a few months after this came out in America. And I really kind of lost sight of the wisdom that all these amazing women had spoken to me about. And so reading it again has been almost like reliving some of the journey and just listening to their voices again. And yeah, I actually stepped back from journalism to write this book. And I then, because of the earthquake, I've never engaged in the same way that I did before. So that's kind of where I came to it. But it's also, since the earthquake, I've kind of become much more dedicated in my own meditation practice. So thank you for the invitation.
No, that's wonderful. So when you started to write this book, was it coming more from your curiosity about nuns in general, because you didn't have a meditation practice before this? Is that right? Like you are not Buddhist. Was this more? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there's a delay on the. I did have a regular meditation practice before. I practice yoga regularly, and I had a daily meditation practice. And in fact, before the pandemic, I attended quite a lot of the Sunday teaching at the London Insight Centre.
here in London. So I did have a meditation practice, but I came to this book at the time. Both my parents died within a few months of each other, very suddenly, in 2011, 2012, and it was sort of a crossroads. I had to make a decision whether I was going to carry on, with the sort of journalism I was doing, or write this book. And I think I was very open to listening and wanting to hear the sort of wisdom that I knew that the women, were all kind of searching for, and also in their teachings passing on to all of us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of shares a commonality with some of the nuns. As I was reading through the book, there was kind of a theme of the women coming to this practice often after they had experienced a tragedy or some kind of great suffering, often the death of someone who is close to them. So that's, an interesting confluence of events for you as you kind of dived into this as well.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it was some of the nuns I spoke to, and it was I think it was not just death, but a life-changing experience. But obviously, that is often for all of us the first time that we encounter somebody very close to us dying, and. Yeah, I think it's, but it wasn't always the case. I think. There was one of because the experience in the East and the West have been quite different. I mean, the way the book is structured, I decided to structure it because of my own ignorance, not understanding how Buddhism had traveled from East to West, and so I was fascinated and trying to understand that. So I start off in Nepal. I then moved to India, then Burma, then Japan, and then come to the east coast of the United States, which is where the so many temples and Buddhist practices were first introduced. So the experience was very different in the East. I think some of a lot of the nuns I met were very young when they when they felt they had a calling, and it was much more accepted in the East. That young girls, parents would because it was very much more in the culture, parents would accept if they felt that was what the child, not always, there was definitely opposition in some cases, but I think in the West, most of the women I interviewed had quite full life experiences before. Some of them had nearly all of them had worked, had very, fascinating jobs. And also, some had been married, some had children, came to it later in life. But I think one thing that was a common theme with all of the women I met was that they were all asking questions about life. Wanting to understand what's it all about. And I think sometimes that comes when somebody dies, particularly. So
yeah, as I was reading that, it just reminded me the story of how the Buddha left his palace and ventured out, left his family, and saw the sick person, the aging person, the dying person. Many of these women and girls, mostly I'm thinking in the East, had some of those kind of same inclinations, just like very just basic inclinations, like what is this all about? That kind of set them. And often I noticed sometimes they were from religious families, sometimes they weren't. And so in some cases, they were kind of setting themselves apart from their family to want to pursue this. I think was showed up in both East and West, for sure. Well, I'm glad you had some meditation experience, because you certainly got a lot of it on these journeys. Sometimes having to wait hours or days to actually speak with your subject. and participate in whatever was going on at the monastery. So it felt like you got very steeped in your subject here. And I'll maybe ask you at the end how that changed you over time. So let's start in the East, and we'll kind of maybe move the conversation west a little bit. Because culturally, these places that you were visiting, they weren't all necessarily predominantly Buddhist countries, but Buddhism was flourishing in some sense in these countries, and where there were monasteries, and but still very patriarchal, still very male-dominated places, where I think it might be helpful to explain a little bit about how the girls or the women were accepted into monastic life in these countries where Buddhism had been flourishing in a very male-centric place. Were they immediately accepted? Were they sidelined? Were they, and I know that maybe it's different in different places, but what did you notice about that from a sort of a woman's point of view?
Yeah, no,
point of view, really.
Yeah. It was very different in different countries, and I think because I started out in Nepal with the Kung Fu nuns, in Gawakilwa, the nunnery in Nepal. I was very struck by the fact that the reason that they were being encouraged to practice Kung Fu was to kind of increase their confidence. And increase their physical strength, but also, give them a sense of self-confidence. And I think it was the motivation behind that was really, as you say, in a lot of societies, they were not traditionally accepted. Certainly nuns, traditionally had a much more subordinate position. And a lot of the orders now are really trying to challenge that and are making, great headways. The Tibetan tradition has the full ordination of nuns in the Tibetan tradition has not been traditionally allowed, but the Dalai Lama has endorsed it. But it has to have full sanctioning by others within the hierarchy, and that hasn't happened. But it is challenged, and there are women in the West who are very dedicated to making sure that nuns can become fully ordained. So there's sort of a pecking order, and in certain orders, for instance, in Burma, full ordination is still not allowed. And that's, the example I cite in the short film is one of the nuns who did dare to, become fully ordained. She actually went to Sri Lanka where it's possible. And she went back to Burma for her father's funeral and was arrested and charged with impersonating a monk and thrown in jail. And there has been a lot of hardship, for women who are challenging the fact that they are, not allowed to take an equal position and take the full precepts. I think in Thailand there's a term that I'm sure I'm not going to pronounce correctly. Maichi, I think is right. No, women who dress in white, shave their heads, live a sort of renunciant life, but they're known as white ghosts, and the society doesn't really accept. Some sections of society sort of shun them, but there are many Maichis in Thailand, and in Burma, where full ordination is not allowed. There are nunneries very dedicated to, making sure that girls and women are becoming very highly educated in all of, all sort of mainstream education, but also, Buddhist teachings. So it's and in Japan, it's a fascinating situation in Japan. I mean, perhaps I can talk about that later because that was very impactful for me. but there was a tradition of temples being passed from father to son in years gone by. But because more women are wanting to become nuns, and they do become fully ordained or known as priests in the Zen tradition, they are taking over the temples so they're known as temple daughters, and they are so it's definitely being challenged very, very energetically and with a lot of courage. In a lot of instances, so it's quite inspiring.
You mentioned the educational aspect of what is the reason maybe some of these girls might go into the monastery, and just having traveled in some of these countries that you mentioned in the book, knowing from the boy's perspective that it's culturally acceptable that you send your son maybe for a couple of years or less, 6 months, maybe even, to be a monk for a little bit, and maybe they'll stay and maybe they won't. But I believe this was long before you were there, that I was there, that it was to get an education. The monasteries were known for having like the best education, certainly like English language education. And so sometimes that's why families would send their children there. It was an affordable place maybe to get an education. Is that some of the same rationale for maybe families? Because we think to give up a daughter or any child, a son, even at 6, 7, 9 years old, whatever, to live apart from the family. I'm just curious what you found in maybe just being around the monastery where some of these very young children were living, and what the family, I don't know if you get to speak to the families, or the other monastics that were there, about how they educate them and take care of them, and just culturally what that's like.
Yeah, I'm not sure which country you were speaking about, but for instance, in Burma, in the Theravada, there's much more of a tradition of being able to take temporary ordination. So go in, as you say, the tradition there is for sons maybe will go for 2 years, or for a summer. For a certain number of months. And one thing that was very noticeable when I was there was that there was a sense that it was also a sanctuary. It was a safe place for girls and young women to be when, being in wider society wasn't necessarily safe. So that was definitely very much part of the kind of the push behind, because I think that I'll get the numbers wrong, but I think there were 30,000 nuns in Burma at the time I was there, which is, that's a high, very high. I mean, compared to the monks, I think 700,000 monks, so a lot more. But it was flourishing. There were more girls wanting to enter monasteries, as you say, also because of the education, because of the high education that it offered. Mm-hmm. But there was no stigma to disrobing, if you like, or coming out of the order. It was very much a matter of choice. If at the age of 18 they decided that wasn't the path they wanted to take, then there wasn't any stigma to that. But it seemed that most did want to carry on the path. That was the impression I got. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was the case in Burma.
And I was thinking of Thailand too. Yeah. So you mentioned that the monasteries were sometimes a place of sanctuary for the girls, a refuge. It just reminded me of the story you tell, and I'm going to forget the country that this was in, but where historically the monastery had been a place, the only place in the country where women could get a divorce.
Yeah, that's right. That was Tokaji temple in Japan, and it was known as the divorce temple, and it was the only place where women could get a divorce. And there was such a clamor, if you like, for women who wanted to go there. that there were a lot of hostels that sprang up around the gate, around the walls of the temple, and it was enough at one point to throw a shoe over the wall to kind of to make the point that you wanted to be able to enter. But
because there was resistance to letting them in.
Well, there was resistance, certainly in society. Yeah, certainly in society. And I can't remember the date, but I think divorce wasn't introduced in a lot of societies, but in Japan until many, many years later. It's Tokije was an extraordinary temple to visit. I mean, it's in Kamakura, outside Tokyo, and they had a practice there traditionally called mirror meditation, where instead of in a lot of Zen traditions you sit facing a wall, but in that tradition you would sit looking in a mirror, it was, I'd like to as I mentioned to you, to read some excerpts, sort of perhaps later whenever we come to them, because I'm not very good on time. But I think it's the idea was, you look into yourself and you see reality, you see beyond yourself. And that was that was the practice at Tokije. That was not the temple that I spent so much time in, but
that mirror meditation was really moving, actually. There was like some poem lines in the book, but around just seeing your reflection and doing a meditative reflection on the body parts and no self and this whole concept.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us the story? You want to tell one? You want to read something now?
I was going to read. I don't know whether we were going to. I was going to start off by reading. Was not so much from the East. It was more in the West. In fact, I don't know whether we want to move on to the West.
Let's shift. We're kind of at one of our halfway points, and I also want to just invite everyone who's live on the call, if you do have a question for Christine, to send it to Ask Questions here in the chat. And then we do have a Q&A time, and I can read some of those for Christine. So go ahead.
Okay, yeah, because the reason I was going to read this out was because the perhaps shifting to the experience of young women, or not all young women in the West, as I say, coming from having been educated, in mainstream education, not going in, as a sort of as a youngster. Most will have had other experiences, work experiences. And this nun called Munisara, who was born to Thai parents and then grew up in the Philippines in a very Catholic environment, which was also a theme through the book. It seemed to be quite a lot of the women had come from Catholic backgrounds, which was quite interesting. This is sort of a side issue, but one of the fascinating, very lively, wonderful nuns I met in Japan. I remember her saying that she was told that as a child, if God calls you, you have to answer the call and become a nun. And she said she used to go to bed at night as a child, with fingers in her ears, because she didn't want to hear the calling. So she definitely had no thought of wanting to become a nun. But she was actually Venezuelan, and I met her in Japan. But the young nun who I was going to read a little bit about was then educated at Harvard, and I met her in California. She was at the Aranya Bodhi Hermitage in Northern California, and she said to me, she says she remembers thinking, what's the point of being smart if you don't know how to be happy? And I really started asking, what does intelligence mean? It seemed to me that the kind of smart that really mattered was happiness. And I didn't see a lot of that in people walking across Harvard Yard. I began asking, what is the point of life? To go to school, to get a good job, to have small people and then get old. And I was like, why? There has to be more to life than this. And she said, everyone asks these kind of questions. It just depends how old you are when you ask them. And she called this a quarter-life crisis. I think she was in her 20s. She'd then gone on to work in London and with a non-profit in New York. And she started becoming much more interested in Buddhist teachings. And she said, for a long time, I kept checking myself, wondering if I was romanticizing the notion of becoming a nun or running away from my responsibilities. So rather than seek ordination straight away, she signed up for a master's program in South Asian Studies. And she goes on to say, there's this whole trend to lay aside Buddhism, especially among the intellectual middle class, to think that you can be a totally dedicated lay practitioner and that monasticism is irrelevant. And then she said, there's no doubt there are lay people who are very dedicated and do wonderful things, but I was very struck by how some people would show up to Dharma teachings in white Christian Dior clothes and then go back to a totally corporate life, taking advantage of people. And there is this conflict in lifestyle, which for monasticism doesn't exist. And then it was rather funny because she sort of said, I haven't become this pious religious type. I'm still the same zany person. And when I asked her if there was anything she missed from her former life when she became a nun, she pauses for a moment, and then she started smiling, and she said what she really missed was dancing. And she said sometimes when she's doing walking meditation, she has this urge to break out in hip hop moves, which in private she sometimes does. So, and then I sort of say, the image of her walking alone when occasionally lifting her saffron robes, swinging her hips and shuffling her feet seems symbolic of the ways in which many of the women I meet are bucking some of the restrictions placed on them over centuries. They're respecting the fundamentals of traditional practice. They're forging ahead with new ways of being Buddhist nuns in the West. And I think that kind of summed up for me, a lot of the struggles that a lot of these women are having, but the courage that they show in just forging ahead anyway with what is not an easy life by any means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had some of those same passages from Munasara underlined as I was reading as well. She was an interesting character for sure. One of the things that she said and that I heard in some other accounts coming through as well was that is the joy that comes from being ordained and having taken vows. And I think that sometimes we might view monasticism as just so much you give up when you take vows and put on robes. And so hearing from the nuns themselves about what's gained was, I think, just really important, because this notion of joy is not something that you often think about. You think about the hours of practice a day and the wisdom that arises. I'm wondering, this is one of my favorite. I keep this. It's men, of course, but I really kind of treasure the teachings on joy that are part of this practice. And that's something that just really stuck with me, that it's by virtue of taking the vows and why becoming fully ordained is so important to so many of these women in all of the countries. There seemed to be a common thread. I underlined something from Tubten Chodron, who said that the question of full ordination has little to do with women's rights. It's not that we want to do what the men do. It's a question of being able to take all the monastic precepts that lay out the path for ethical conduct. Living with precepts helps us to refine our behavior and purify our actions, setting the stage for cultivating concentration and wisdom. And how it just kind of really stuck with me, that this sort of half ordination or whatever's preventing. And you wrote the book so long ago that I think some things have changed in these countries. It's kind of like a slow change, and I'm not necessarily up to speed on the latest with each tradition and what's happening, but currently. But this notion that full ordination would not be available, it's not so much of a, wanting to have everything the men have, but just personally being able to be fulfilled in that same way. That I think was really moving. The dedication of these women is amazing. I mean, kind of intestinal fortitude that you have to stick with this practice, which kind of leads me into one of my other questions about, because so much fortitude is required to live the monastic life, despite all of the benefits and the fruits of this deep practice, I'm just wondering what the future of monasticism looks like in places like in the West, where we're really not that supported. We don't have that many monasteries, especially for women. They are springing up now in the West. And I can't help but think of Aya Yeshe, who is an Australian nun at the Bodhicitta Daikini monastery in Australia, who speaks she's very outspoken on the need for support for women monastics, and how so many drop out or disrobe because they're just not able to be supported. And if anything kind of stands out in your memory and speaking to some of these Western monastics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely the sense, and quite a few of the nuns in the West spoke about it. It's not easy, that in the East there's much more of a tradition. There is more support, familial support, financial support, and in the West that's not the case. Women have to find their own way forward. I think one of the nuns I spoke to in Dharamsala, I loved the image that she gave. She sort of said, sometimes I feel like nuns are like icebergs that are melting away, the significance of which will not be realized until we're gone. And she also said, and this was a theme that was echoed by quite a lot of the women I spoke to. She said, I think it's very important to have a group of people who are living a life based on contentment with little, who live the example that genuine joy comes from within, from a sense of leading a life well lived. The importance of having communities of ordained women in all different traditions in the community is that the wisdom that they are able to teach others. Another nuns sort of referred to it as like yeast in society. It kind of percolates up, it rises somehow, and I think. I didn't get any sense that any of these women were giving up. I mean, when you talk about the future, I mean, I kind of came away from it very optimistic. There was a lot of energy, a lot of wonderful teachers in the West, that you will have had, had speaking with your group, and I've had the privilege of listening. To as you say, Thubten Chodron, Roshi John Halifax in Santa Fe. Here in Europe, in Thich Nhat Hanh, many of the nuns in Plum Village, and a wonderful African American nun who I met at Plum Village, who's now who I kept in touch with, and we're still in touch. She's now teaching youngsters, juveniles in Memphis, juveniles in detention in Memphis, and I think that's one of the things that I wanted to stress. And maybe you were going to ask me is, I think. My sort of preconception when I started this book was it was going to be a lot easier, because I thought a lot of these women were going to be kind of sitting quietly in their nunneries, and I was going to be able to go and visit them and sort of speak to them. And they're incredibly active. They're very, very engaged in their communities. They're all over the place. They're teaching, the senior teachers are going all over the world giving teachings. And it was very difficult to pin them down and sort of, find when I could actually, when they had time to sort of to sit and speak to me. But also the work that they're doing in communities is incredible. I mean, there's a lot of that was perhaps another short reading I can give. One of the most impactful experiences I had during not so much personally, but it just really brought home to me the importance of the work these women are doing, was a prison visit. Because there is a lot of I think in British prisons, for instance, Buddhism is the fastest growing religion. And I was dismayed when I think something like a quarter of the world's prison population is in the United States. Huge numbers, 2 million of incarcerated in the United States, and there's a lot of there's the Phoenix Prison Project started by Rabina Cortain, the wonderful Australian, extremely dynamic, very now in her 80s, going all over the world teaching. And Thubten Chodron's Sravasti Abbey in Washington State, I went with a group of the nuns into a prison. They were having once a month, the nuns go in and visit the prisoners. And I think it was designated a medium security. And so I thought they were probably, not in, for very serious crimes. And the policy of the nuns was not to ask, why the men are there. It was all male prison. But in fact, some of the men I spoke to, without me asking, so said they were in for life. There were a lot of lifers there. Shall I just sort of read that a bit? Because as I say, it was very, it really. Well, Rabina Cortain, this was not in Washington, this was actually a teaching she gave in London. She sort of said, there are no bars worse than the prison of one's own mind. And Thubten Chodron then was talking about, how when we get a letter from prison inmates describing, a prison inmate describing how he's sitting on his top bunk, a few feet away from a bare bulb, meditating with noise and commotion all around, it cuts down on our complaining radically. When we really realize how difficult it is for these, prisoners to meditate. And she said, often the most receptive to Buddhist teachings are lifers who will never be released, whose only chance of freedom is an inner sense of freedom, and in a sense of liberation that comes from truly accepting who they are and acknowledging what they've done and consciously transforming their minds. And one of the scenes I remember in that prison that really, for me, was incredible. It was a day when they were, the prisoners who were attending, who were regular Buddhist practitioners, they were invited to offer a gift. And one of them stood up and danced this incredible dance. And shall I just read that, just the description of it? Because for me, it was very beautiful. One man with a long, thin, braided ponytail steps to the front. His offering is to be a performance. As a fellow inmate presses a button on a portable CD player and the sound of a melodic Buddhist chant fills the room, the man closes his eyes and raises himself on tiptoes. Very slowly, he begins to weave a dance of such grace and elegance that I find myself holding my breath. With his arms circling slowly around his waist, his body pirouettes, bends and twists in intricate maneuvers that blend the refinement of classical ballet with modern dance. His movements have a delicacy that defies his harsh surroundings and strike me as extraordinarily brave in the company of convicted, and frustrated criminals. And I remember later he told me that he used to be a professional dancer. I think he was there for life. So yeah, and I remember the men, who I spoke with afterwards, they just sort of said that when the nuns come in, they just feel tall, and for a few weeks afterwards, they're able to sort of, stand tall, and it was an incredible experience for them to have these nuns come in and speak to them, and I know, for instance, with Sister Peace, her teachings in juvenile detention centers in Memphis, I think, they're speaking to very receptive, people who really have hit rock bottom. And I think a lot of the teachings speak to that, when we all reach, rock bottom throughout our lives in different ways. And yeah, it was just the work that these women are definitely not sitting in nunneries, spending all their time meditating. They're the Kung Fu nuns, for instance, after the earthquake in Nepal, they were, devastating earthquake in Kathmandu. They were out with, sacks of rice on their backs, trekking out to remote villages and taking rice. So that was my preconception, not understanding really what the life was. And I think it's very inspiring.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that reading as well. When one of our last second Sunday Dharma series, we spoke with Matthew Hahn, who's a former prisoner, and was talking about the importance of the prison ministry in general, and how he found Buddhism there, and how some of the lifers are really spiritual giants because of the depth of their practice. So thank you for highlighting that. And just the physical labor of being a nun is something that they're not just going out into the community, they're doing all of the work that it takes to sustain themselves, because they may go on alms rounds for their food, but there's still the work of caring for the place they're living, the monastery, and it's just physical work. You mentioned Roshi Joan Halifax, who I believe turned 80 this past year. And I see her on Facebook, and I've been out to practice with her, but she's chopping wood and still chopping wood and all of those things for sustenance. And so one of the other things that I read was about sometimes we talk about what's going to happen in the future are fewer and fewer people going to want to ordain, but the statistic about the Catholic Church nuns really in decline, as the Buddhist people wanting to become Buddhist monastics is really on the rise. And the importance of having that monastic community, somewhere in the book, one of the nuns mentions how in the West, it's wonderful that these practices are so prolific in the West, but that the focus has really been on the Sangha, the lay practitioner community, which is wonderful, and much less emphasis on monastics, and how that's kind of perhaps the way of the future, but kind of brings about a bit of an imbalance. And I know here in the IMCW community, we've just felt so blessed over the last year. I think she's here, our Aya Dhamadipa, who fell from heaven to land in our midst in Washington, D.C., and has just been such a blessing to the teachers at the Insight Meditation Community of Washington and others as well, as not just a repository of deep Dharma wisdom, but an example of the ethics and the precepts and the vows. It's just sort of like you said about the prisoners, when the nuns come in, you stand taller. There's something that just, I don't think can be replaced in a lay community. So I don't know what the future holds, but that's something that I hope it's not easy to become ordained in the West these days. Because the communities have to support themselves, you have to be under a certain age, you have to be physically healthy, you have to have enough money in the bank to support yourself, or to, and it varies by denomination, of course, but it's not just something that anyone can do and in midlife or later in life.
Yeah, I was just, as you were saying that, I was just remembering. Well, I was trying to find it because I I can't find anything in my.
There's no way I could find it either right now. So if you found it, that's great.
It was, I think it was Roshi Joan actually was speaking at Davos, and she was saying, that there's the danger of secularizing and commodifying Buddhism. It means it's stripping it of its ethical framework. That lies at the heart of monastic practice, and I think that's tremendous value that women who choose this as a full-time path, the depth of their practice is so valuable, to those in the lay community, to all of us in the lay community, but. No, when you were just saying about having money in the bank, it that reminded me, for instance, of Plum Village. I remember the Sister Peace sort of explaining to me that the practice there. Forgive me if I've got this wrong. I'm sure I'm making lots of mistakes, but I think I remember correctly. She said that the practice was, if you entered. Plum Village, for instance, you entered the I think they've introduced a practice of temporary ordination now. So like you, I'm not up to date, but I think she was, in her case, and it was a common practice that you were basically expected to give up all your, to get rid of what she described as, I think the term was red dust. That's always stuck with me. All our possessions, everything around us, our home, our clothes, whatever, as red dust. And the practice was to give it all up, and sell it, give it away to charity, but not, for instance, to give the money to Plum Village. That was an important principle, because they didn't want the feeling that men and women, because Plum Village is monks monks and nuns, not to go in with a feeling that they were somehow owed something, but they went in and. So in that case, I think they did give everything up. But I think for some women, it is a question of, especially if you're not living in a community. And I don't want to give the impression, and I think I haven't in this book, that all nuns are living in monasteries or temples. They, a lot of nuns are, living on their own in communities, and I think that's when it's particularly difficult then for them to be able to support themselves. And you mentioned right at the beginning, the practice of Dharma, not charging for teachings, but the experience of offering, of students who go to listen, offering something, as sort of gratitude. And that was something, again, that struck me in Burma, for instance. The most of what you see in the short film at the beginning is shot in the East, and the practice in the nuns in Burma, they're only allowed to go out on alms. What do you call it? Alms
rounds?
I was going to say arms race. That's completely wrong. Alms rounds, yeah. Sorry, the nuns are only allowed to go out once a month. No, 4 times a month. I beg your pardon. And it's to coincide with the cycles of the moon, whereas the monks go out every day. And the nuns are allowed to receive money and food, uncooked food. But the very important principle is that I remember them so stressing is that the reason that the alms rounds are so important is to give lay people the opportunity to give. it's not just for the monastics to receive. It's to give lay people the opportunity to give, and it was this sort of practice of giving and receiving, and that by giving people the opportunity to give, you're actually giving them a gift. And so I think it's very hard. I think particularly in the West, it's very hard for a lot of monastics to keep going. A lot of these centres are relying on the generosity of benefactors.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have a question here from Aya, who writes, Christine, thank you for writing this book and sharing these stories in a compassionate way. One thread that runs through the book is the strength of the nuns, but a strength that is about perseverance. I wonder whether you found that nuns who were living in nuns' monasteries was a source of strength, a defense, a convenience, a difficulty, ? In other words, are convents a support for the women you met?
That's interesting. I mean, when you mention difficulty, something springs to mind, particularly the Nisodo training temple in Japan, which was personally very important for me. And I remember the one of the nuns I spoke to there, she was being sent from Brazil by her teacher in Brazil, who said, go and train, but you're going into hell. And she said that the first year that she was there was hell. It was incredibly difficult living in such close quarters with other, with other women. And the term that she used was that it was like polishing a pebble. The practice was to really, by living in close community, you were learning how to get on. How it's a kind of a shedding of the ego, and a learning how to it was a polishing of a pebble, but it was polishing of the ego, getting rid of the ego, really. And I remember also in the first the Gawakiwa in Nepal, the Kung Fu nuns, for instance, one of the points that was made there was that they were kept so busy that they didn't really have a chance to, for any arguments to break out, because they just didn't have time. I think they had one day, a Sunday, when they could wash their clothes, but they were still meditating, and all the, like you say, the upkeep of the physical upkeep of the building was tremendously hard work. So I think there was a lot of hardship involved, but I think also one of the nuns I spoke to, sort of said it's also incredibly comforting and important to be surrounded by other, practitioners, other women, and not necessarily, as I say, in Plum Village, it's men and women. And Sravasti Abbey, while I was there, it was just women, but I know the intention, Thubten Chodron's intention, was that it was going to be a training centre for men and women. It probably is now. I'm sorry, I don't know. So I think, there was tremendous strength to be gained from that, being in a community. As I say, in Burma, it was a refuge because of the terrible political situation there. So I think it was very individual for, in different sort of traditions, different places.
Yeah. Thank you. A question from Laura. She asks, what conflicts did you see? For example, I understand that in most monasteries for women, male priests are still in control of finances and expenditures, hold the power in many ways. What was your experience in the East and the West?
Well, I didn't see that. I have to say, I didn't see that. I think there's definitely, a very strict hierarchy in some of the Tibetan traditions, for instance, in Theravada, and I'm sure in Japan, traditionally, a lot of the Zen temples were, the women were expected to do the work, for the monks. But I didn't see, I think I wasn't being selective in any way, in the places I went to. But I saw strength. I was coming across, stories of strength, not subjugation. I mean, certainly, as I say, the story of Nima coming across from Tibet, and a lot of young nuns are coming across from Tibet. I think less so now; it's much more difficult. But yeah, I think they were facing a lot of hardship. And I know, for instance, I interviewed the Dalai Lama's sister-in-law, and she had set up a nunnery in Dharamsala. The nuns project there was to offer a place where nuns were, respected and taught and cared for, because they wouldn't have had that sort of sanctuary otherwise. So I think there is a lot of hardship, but I have to say that the women I spoke to were not downtrodden. They really weren't. They were making their way, very determined.
Yeah. There's just, if you haven't yet read the book, so this has been up on our website for a little over a month. So I know some people have already gotten it and read it, but there's so many just interesting stories about the women who chose to give up their previous life, some of which were quite colorful. I'm thinking of the novelist, the romance novelist, which maybe is putting it mildly. I don't know.
She called it romance, but it's actually erotic fiction. She's still writing. Well, unfortunately, she died. She's died now, but she was well into her 90s, and she was still writing. They were incredible. I mean, that was one of the more colorful encounters. Jacucho Situcci, and she was out, protesting on the streets, sort of on hunger strike, against the reintroduction of the death sentence in Japan. She was sort of a rock star, really, in Japan. She was very, very well known. But she had, she'd been a very, very celebrated novelist before she ordained, and she carried on writing after she ordained, and she, she's won, most of the many top literary prizes in Japan since ordaining. But some of the lives, I think I said in the little film, there was an anti-terrorist policewoman. There was the first commercial airline pilot, female commercial airline pilot in Switzerland. There was a former BBC journalist in Plum Village. There was goodness, I can't remember all the examples now. My mind is going blank, but they'd come from very, there's a Tibetan princess, a Bollywood, Hollywood Bollywood actress, very successful one. They were coming from very diverse backgrounds and very, they certainly weren't coming because they were looking for. They were looking for a different path, but not because they hadn't been able to make a way in the world before. That was definitely the case.
That was definitely an interesting part. So I'm just curious what it was like for you personally to have access to them in such an intimate way. And someone has a related question too, but how long was your whole journey, and what did you notice in yourself, like as you kind of deepened along this path of getting to know these women?
Yeah, I think I came to it. I kind of, in my mind, it was almost like I was coming to it on my knees. I was really losing both your parents, quite suddenly, quite close together. I was really kind of broken in a way. And so it was a very, the journey that, I didn't do it all in one go. I mean, I may give that impression in the book because that's the way I kind of chose to write it. But it was about 2 years. I was kind of on the road for 2 years, but I was actually physically not really I've spent my life, traveling the globe, and as a reporter, but I was actually physically very, very weak. In fact, I collapsed in Nepal, and I had to kind of come home. I was really, there was a flu epidemic there, and I had a bad case of flu, but I was hospitalized. But I felt very physically weak, and I think it was very hard in lots of ways. But it was also healing, because I really was in environments where these women were talking about what mattered in life. There was nothing kind of, although there was a lot of joy, as you say, there was a lot of joy, a lot of joking, a lot of, but there was a kindness, a real sort of kindness and an understanding of the human condition and the difficulties of the human condition. And I think, I was going to end by talking about Nisodo a little bit, the Zen training temple in Japan, because as you say, it was not like I arrived and people sat down and were willing to talk to me straight away. I almost had to prove myself, or I certainly had to enter into, I had to, for instance, in Nisodo, they were having a monthly session before I spoke to any of the women. So it was 3 days of intensive meditation from 4:00 in the morning, until 10:00 at night, sitting for long, long periods of time, and facing the wall, facing a piece of a wooden sort of paneling. I felt like I came to know every grain in that wooden panel, in all those long hours. But it was, for me, I think it really did shift something very, very sort of profoundly, because I started seeing the way my mind was working, the way that grief was sort of in my body and in my mind, and just being able to kind of see those thoughts and not, the practice is very much, as we know in all meditation traditions, is not to hold on to thoughts, not to grasp them, to sort of observe them and to see that they all pass, like weather patterns in the mind. And so for me, that the week I spent in that temple in Japan was very, very, even before I spoke to the women themselves, just being in that environment and going through that practice was very, very helpful. And I really came to see afterwards that writing this book was a gift. It was a gift to me to be able to sort of spend that time. I think I was going to sort of end with the. If I can find it.
Yes, please. Take your time.
I can't find it. Where am I going to find it? Yeah, this was in Nisodo, and this was a young woman called Geshin. Well, that was her monastic name. She was born in San Francisco. She went to Wesley College. Very highly educated. But she sort of said, after she sort of graduated, I went to the beach, I cooked, I wrote part of a novel, I had everything I wanted, I had a boyfriend, but I was so unhappy. I realized then there were no positive conditions that were going to do it for me. And this is just what the Buddha realized when he was surrounded by luxury in his palace. She spent some time traveling in India, then she moved to Japan and to Nisodo. She said shortly afterwards, partly fueled by a wish to practice in an all-female environment. So that's an answer to one of the other questions. This is my way of turning the light inwards, answering questions about what it means to be alive. Now I can't imagine living any other life. My life is not about me anymore. It's about something bigger. And then she quotes the teaching of Soto Zen Master Dogen, and this is what really has stayed with me always. In his words, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be enlightened by 10,000 things. So, yeah. for me, that was a gift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a wonderful way to kind of sum up what a journey you went on. And yeah, it's always interesting how our personal lives and things kind of intertwine, and kind of in looking back and reflecting on the things that you learned and that you're able to just bring to the world through this book. So someone just asked, what's the name of the book? It's in the United States, it's In Search of Buddha's Daughters, and it looks like this. Yeah, highly recommend that.
In the UK, it's the Saffron Road.
Saffron Road it has a different cover, I think. It looks.
I think there are 4 different covers. Hardback, paperback. But that's the US paperback.
And when will I was talking to Christine before we got on, and she's writing a new book about her experience going through the earthquake in Italy, and it's called what's the name of it?
When the Mountains Dance. When
will it be released?
It's coming out in the UK in March the 29th, I think, next year. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's like a little plug for that. Well, I think we've gotten to most of our questions. Maybe we'll just end with a short meditation, a short sitting, before we go. So again, thank you all for being here and for donating and offering your dana to IMCW in exchange for these wonderful authors and teachers that we bring. So maybe just finding a comfortable sitting posture. And just taking a few deep breaths and feeling your body, sitting or lying down, wherever you're joining us from. Just breathing attention down into the body, following the breath down through the throat and into the chest, into the heart space. And just noticing what's alive in this moment. And as we reflect on the stories that we've heard today about our sister monastics throughout the world, and just letting the resonance of those stories really take root. Just the community of monastics practicing on behalf of all beings. And just offering any benefit from our gathering today to the continued support and sustenance of our monastic community. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you, interpreters. and back office tech people, everyone who makes these sessions possible. I hope you can join us next month for our talk with Ben Conley in January for Shyla Catherine. Such a pleasure. Christine, take care. Good night at your end of the world.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.